The message was signed simply, Justice. Can we trace it? Jonathan asked, passing the message to Nilith. She examined it, antennae twitching in frustration. Impossible. It was relayed through 17 different systems with quantum encryption at each jump. Jonathan paced his office, mind racing. Vale must be working with someone. The sabotage didn't stop when he left the station. The Tordarian Commerce Guild would have resources to assist him, Nilith suggested. Or anyone else who suffered from my uncle's schemes, Jonathan countered. Which, if Talia's research is correct, could be half the known galaxy. That evening, Jonathan called an emergency meeting of his most trusted advisors, Nilith, Talia, and surprisingly, High Commissioner Zorel, whose initial skepticism had evolved into cautious support over the months. I need absolute honesty, Jonathan began after explaining what they'd discovered. Did any of you know about my uncle's involvement in creating these crises? Zorel's neck crests flattened in what Jonathan recognized as solemnity. Rumors existed. Dominic Reed's ethical flexibility was well known. But allegations of this magnitude require evidence few could obtain. And now Vale has that evidence, Nilith added. The question is what he intends to do with it. Expose everything, if his message is sincere, Jonathan said. Which means we need to move first. You'd expose your own uncle's crimes? Zorel asked, studying him intently. I'd expose the truth, Jonathan replied firmly. Whatever it is. These refugees deserve to know why they lost their homes, their families. And if the foundation was built on blood money, that needs to be addressed openly. Talia's light brightened with approval. But exposing everything could destroy what you've built. The backlash would be immediate. Then we need to transform, not just expose, Jonathan said, an idea forming as he spoke. If my uncle's wealth came from creating crises, then it's only right that it goes toward healing the damage he caused. But it has to be more than charity, it has to be reparation. He turned to Voxel, who had been hovering silently nearby. Show me every investment, every asset linked to Celestial Trust. I want to know exactly what we're working with. As the AI projected a complex network of holdings spanning hundreds of worlds, Jonathan began to see not just the enormity of his uncle's crimes, but also the potential for redemption. We're going to beat Vale to the punch, he announced. We'll expose everything ourselves, but simultaneously announce the complete restructuring of the Foundation. Total transparency, oversight committees led by representatives from affected species, and transition of ownership, 51% of all assets transferred to a collective trust managed by refugee communities. Zorel flared her crests in surprise. You'd give up control? I never wanted control, Jonathan admitted. I wanted to do good. And I can't do that while profiting from my uncle's crimes, even unknowingly. As the meeting continued late into the night, plans taking shape for what would be the most dramatic transformation of wealth and power in recent galactic history, Jonathan caught Talia watching him, her light pulsing in a pattern he'd never seen before. What? He asked during a brief break. I'm trying to determine, she said softly, if you're extraordinarily noble or extraordinarily naive. Jonathan laughed, the sound tinged with exhaustion. Probably both. Does it matter? Perhaps not, she replied, her light warming to a gentle glow. As long as you're also extraordinarily careful. Vale isn't the only threat. When word spreads of what you intend to do, many powerful entities will move to stop you, including some you currently count as allies. As if to emphasize her warning, Jonathan's secure comm unit chimed with an incoming message from Ambassador Krull, requesting an urgent private meeting. Let the games begin, Jonathan muttered, squaring his shoulders. The path ahead was dangerous, but for the first time since learning of his inheritance, he felt certain of his direction. The foundation his uncle had built through destruction, Jonathan would rebuild through truth, no matter the personal cost. Lieutenant Beatrice Winters pulled her cloak tighter against the biting wind as she rode into the small village of Thornwick. Tucked away at the edge of the veiled marshes, the settlement served as the last outpost of civilization before the treacherous wilderness began. 3 days had passed since Captain Leonard Ashford's tragic death, and the Queen had personally tasked Beatrice with retrieving his personal effects from his lodgings here. The lieutenant had known Leonard for nearly a decade. They had trained together, fought together, and shared countless campfires during expeditions. His loss felt like a physical wound. The Marsh Hound Inn, she muttered to herself, scanning the weathered signs until she spotted the faded painting of a bedraggled dog. She dismounted and handed the reins to a stable boy. "Keep her fed and watered," Beatrice instructed, passing the boy a silver coin. "I won't be long." The innkeeper, a stooped woman with shrewd eyes, looked up as Beatrice entered. Recognition flickered across her face at the Royal Guard uniform. "You're here about the captain's things, then?" she asked, not waiting for an answer. "Terrible business, that. Never known the Quicksands to take someone so experienced with the marshes." Beatrice nodded grimly. "The Queen is in mourning. Captain Ashford was highly valued. He kept a room here year-round," the innkeeper said, producing a key. "Second floor, end of the hall. Everything's as he left it." The lieutenant ascended the narrow staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. Opening the door to Leonard's room revealed a Spartan space, a narrow bed, a writing desk covered with maps and notes, and a chest containing spare clothing and exploration gear. Beatrice moved methodically, gathering his journals, maps, and personal items into a leather satchel. Her fingers traced the captain's handwriting, confident strokes detailing the marsh's secrets, sketches of strange mechanisms found in the ruins, and theories about their purpose. The Queen would want all of this. After securing the room, Beatrice headed back downstairs. She paused at the inn's tavern, deciding a drink would fortify her for the journey back to the capital. "Whiskey," she told the barkeep, placing a coin on the counter. "The good stuff, not the swill you serve the locals." As she waited, her gaze drifted across the dimly lit room. A lone figure sat hunched in the corner, nursing a drink. Something about his posture struck her as familiar, but his face was obscured by a hood. The barkeep slid her whiskey across the counter. "That one's been here since yesterday," he said, following her gaze. "Barely talks, drinks like a man haunted." Beatrice lifted her glass, then froze as the hooded man shifted, his profile briefly illuminated by lamplight. It couldn't be. She abandoned her untouched drink and moved across the room with practiced stealth. The man didn't look up until she was standing directly before him. "Captain Ashford?" Beatrice whispered, her voice constricted with disbelief. Bloodshot eyes stared back at her from a face she knew as well as her own. Leonard Ashford, or his perfect double, looked up with an expression of dull confusion. "Lieutenant Winters," he replied, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" Beatrice's hand instinctively moved to her sword hilt. "You're supposed to be dead. The Queen saw you sink into the Quicksands 3 days ago." Leonard's brow furrowed, genuine bewilderment crossing his features. "The expedition, yes, I remember the Quicksands." He rubbed his temples. "But I escaped somehow. Found myself on solid ground at the marsh's edge. Everything between is foggy." "Impossible," Beatrice hissed, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "No one escapes the deep sands. The Queen is in mourning. The kingdom thinks you're dead." Leonard looked down at his trembling hands. "I don't understand it either. I've been trying to piece together what happened, but my memory." He trailed off, then looked up with sudden urgency. "Don't tell anyone I'm here." "Not yet. Something isn't right." Beatrice studied him intently. This was Leonard, every scar, every feature matched her memory, yet something subtle felt off. His eyes lacked their usual sharp intelligence, replaced by a haunted vacancy. "Show me your left forearm," she demanded suddenly. Leonard hesitated, then rolled up his sleeve. There it was, the distinctive crescent-shaped scar from a skirmish they'd fought together years ago. "This makes no sense," Beatrice murmured, sitting down heavily across from him. "I was just in your room, collecting your belongings for the Queen." "My room?" Leonard looked genuinely confused. "I haven't been to my room. I've been here, trying to remember." A cold suspicion crept up Beatrice's spine. "What's the last thing you remember clearly?" Leonard took a long drink before answering. "The expedition. The fog. The ground giving way beneath me." His eyes grew distant. "Then darkness, pressure all around me, certain I was about to die." He shuddered. "Next thing I knew, I was stumbling out of the marshes covered in mud, my equipment gone, with no memory of how I escaped." "And you came straight here?" "Where else would I go?" "I needed to gather my thoughts before reporting back. Something happened to me in those quicksands, Beatrice. Something I can't explain." Beatrice leaned forward, lowering her voice. "The ancient technology you were researching for the Queen, could it be related?" A flash of recognition crossed Leonard's face. "The ruins, the devices we found." He straightened suddenly. "There were chambers beneath the ruins. We never fully explored them." The lieutenant made a swift decision. "We need to get you out of here. If word reaches the capital that you're alive before we understand what happened, it could be dangerous." "Dangerous? For whom?" "For you," Beatrice said grimly. "Think about it, Leonard. Someone could have arranged your death. And if they learn it didn't take..." Understanding dawned on Leonard's face. The markers on the path, they'd been moved. "I realized it just before I fell." Beatrice stood, dropping coins on the table. "We leave now, out the back. Pull your hood low." She touched the hilt of her dagger. "And until we know what's happening, you were never here, and I never saw you." As they slipped into the gathering dusk, neither noticed the tavern stable boy watching intently before disappearing down an alley to meet his other employer, a messenger bound for Lord Edmund's estate with news that would significantly complicate the nobleman's carefully laid plans. The capital city of Aldoria gleamed in the morning sun, its white stone buildings and blue-tiled roofs presenting a facade of peace and prosperity. From their vantage point on the hillside overlooking the city, Beatrice and Leonard watched the royal flags flying at half-mast, a kingdom still mourning a man who stood very much alive. "We'll enter through the eastern gate at dusk," Beatrice said, lowering her spyglass. "The changing of the guard creates enough confusion that we should pass unnoticed." Leonard nodded, his eyes fixed on the palace spires. "And then?" "My quarters first. We need to understand what's happening before approaching the Queen." Beatrice studied Leonard's profile, still unnerved by the subtle wrongness she sensed. "You're certain you want to proceed?" "Once we're in the capital, the danger increases tenfold." "I serve the Queen," Leonard replied without hesitation. "If someone engineered my death to harm her, I must know who, and why." They had traveled for 2 days, avoiding main roads and royal messengers. During that time, Beatrice had observed Leonard carefully. He possessed all the captain's knowledge, mannerisms, and memories, yet occasional gaps appeared, moments where he'd reach for a name or event that should have been readily accessible but wasn't. As promised, they slipped into the city at dusk, Leonard's face concealed beneath a deep hood. The capital buzzed with traders, merchants, and citizens finishing their daily business. No one paid attention to 2 more cloaked figures navigating the narrow streets. The Royal Guard barracks stood adjacent to the palace, connected by a covered walkway. Beatrice led Leonard through servants' passages she had used countless times during clandestine missions, finally reaching her private quarters without detection. "You can remove the cloak," she said, securing the door and lighting a lamp. "No one will disturb us here." Leonard sank heavily onto a chair, exhaustion evident in his posture. What now? Beatrice moved to a cabinet and retrieved a hidden compartment containing several scrolls. We start with what we know. Your expedition was searching for ancient technology in the ruins. The Queen believed these artifacts could strengthen the kingdom. She unrolled a map of the Veiled Marshes. Show me exactly where you fell. Leonard leaned forward, his finger hovering over the parchment before settling on a location. Here, near the western ruins. We had already excavated the eastern chambers in previous expeditions. And the Queen was there to see these ruins herself, Beatrice mused. Why now, after all your previous expeditions? Because I had finally found something substantial, evidence of mechanisms that could harness energy from the Earth itself. Leonard's eyes brightened with genuine enthusiasm. Imagine, Beatrice, power without coal or wood. Clean energy that could transform our kingdom. Making Aldoria a target for our neighbors, Beatrice noted. Who knew about this discovery? Leonard frowned. The Queen, of course. The royal advisors. Lord Edmund was particularly interested. He oversees the kingdom's resources and trade. Lord Edmund. Beatrice's expression darkened. The Queen's cousin. Next in line to the throne if Her Majesty remains childless. You suspect him? Leonard asked. He's always been loyal to the crown. To the crown, perhaps. To Queen Eleonora specifically? Beatrice shrugged. He opposed her coronation. Argued that a woman couldn't lead effectively. She tapped the map thoughtfully. And he has interests in the marshlands. Mining ventures, if I recall correctly. Leonard stood abruptly. We need to return to the marshes. If my incident was deliberate, there might be evidence near where I fell. Beatrice shook her head. Too dangerous. The Queen has likely ordered the area secured until she can send another expedition. She rolled up the map. We need information first. And I know where to get it. Under cover of darkness, they made their way to the Royal Archives, a repository of knowledge accessible only to the highest-ranking officials. Using her guard credentials, Beatrice led them past the night watchman and into the vast library. Here, she said, pulling a heavy ledger from a shelf. Records of all expeditions to the Veiled Marshes for the past decade. And this, she retrieved another volume, contains Lord Edmund's mining grants and operations. For hours, they pored over the documents, piecing together a troubling pattern. Lord Edmund had acquired land throughout the marshes over the past 5 years, concentrating around areas where ancient ruins had been discovered. He wasn't mining for ore, Leonard murmured, connecting the locations on a map. He was searching for the same technology one discovered. Beatrice nodded grimly. And when you found it first, you became an obstacle. A noise outside the archives startled them. Beatrice quickly doused their lamp as footsteps approached. They pressed into the shadows between tall shelves as the door opened, revealing 2 figures in hushed conversation. Cannot proceed until we're certain, came a familiar voice. Lord Edmund himself, his aristocratic profile visible in the dim corridor light. The duplicate was spotted in Thornwick, replied his companion. If he reaches the Queen before we retrieve the original. He won't, Edmund interrupted. Increase the guard at the laboratory. No one enters or leaves the tunnels without my authorization. Beatrice and Leonard exchanged shocked glances as the men continued down the corridor, their voices fading. Duplicate? Leonard whispered once they were alone. Original? Beatrice stared at him, pieces falling into place. The ancient technology, what if it's not just about energy? Her hand unconsciously moved to her sword. What if it could create copies, perfect duplicates of people? Leonard looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. That would explain the memory gaps. The feeling of wrongness. His eyes met Beatrice's, filled with horror. "Am I not real?" "Don't," Beatrice said firmly. "Whatever you are, you're Leonard Ashford in every way that matters." She began gathering the documents. But if Edmund was talking about an original, then the real Leonard might still be alive. "The laboratory," Leonard said, determination replacing shock. Edmund mentioned tunnels. Beatrice nodded. "The old mining tunnels beneath his estate connect to the marsh lowlands." She closed the ledger with a decisive snap. "We need to investigate, tonight." As they slipped out of the archives, Leonard grappled with the implications of what they'd overheard. If he was a duplicate, what did that make him? A copy? An imposter? Yet his loyalty to the Queen, his sense of duty, felt absolutely real. "Beatrice," he said as they moved through the shadows toward the city's outer ring, where Edmund's estate stood. "If we find the original Leonard, what then?" Beatrice's expression softened momentarily. "Then we save him. And together, we stop whatever Edmund is planning." She squeezed his arm reassuringly. "One step at a time, Captain." The moon rose high as they approached Lord Edmund's estate, its imposing walls patrolled by guards bearing the nobleman's personal crest rather than the royal insignia, a detail that further confirmed their suspicions. Something unauthorized was happening here, beyond the Queen's knowledge or approval. And somewhere beneath those walls might be the answer to the mystery of Leonard Ashford's impossible survival, and the truth about the man who now bore his name and memories. The entrance to the mining tunnels lay hidden behind a weathered storage shed on the eastern edge of Lord Edmund's estate. Beatrice and Leonard crouched in the shadows, watching as guards patrolled with a frequency that suggested something far more valuable than abandoned mines lay beneath. 3-minute intervals, Beatrice whispered, counting the seconds between patrols. "Precise. Military." Leonard nodded. "Not typical estate guards. These men are trained soldiers." His eyes narrowed. "Some I recognize from the Royal Battalion. Edmund has been recruiting from within the Queen's forces." Beatrice's expression hardened. "Treason upon treason." They waited until the patrol passed, then darted across the open ground to the shed. The door's lock yielded easily to Beatrice's skilled hands. Inside, beneath piles of discarded mining equipment, they discovered a trapdoor. "Ready?" Beatrice asked, her hand on the iron ring. Leonard drew his borrowed sword. "Lead on, Lieutenant." The tunnels below were unexpectedly well maintained, not the abandoned passages they had anticipated, but active corridors lit by strange blue lamps that emitted light without flame. The walls themselves seemed to hum with an energy that made the hair on their arms stand on end. "This technology," Leonard whispered, examining one of the lamps. "It matches my research on the ancient ruins." He touched the wall, feeling the subtle vibration. "Edmund has been developing it in secret while I searched the marshes." They proceeded cautiously, following the main passage as it descended deeper beneath the estate. The tunnel eventually opened into a vast underground chamber filled with equipment that merged familiar metalwork with the strange, glowing technology of the ancients. Workers in protective gear operated complex machinery, oblivious to the intruders watching from the shadowed entrance. "What is this place?" Beatrice breathed, taking in the scale of the operation. Before Leonard could answer, a side door opened, and Lord Edmund himself entered, accompanied by a thin, bespectacled man in a laboratory coat. The workers immediately straightened, showing deference. "Progress, Professor Harlow?" Edmund demanded, his aristocratic voice carrying across the chamber. "The prototype functions as designed, my lord," the professor replied, gesturing to a large cylindrical tank filled with swirling, luminescent fluid. "The duplicate integration rate has improved to nearly 87%. "Not good enough," Edmund snapped. "The Queen grows more suspicious by the day. We need the duplicates to be perfect, indistinguishable from the originals in every way." Duplicates, Leonard whispered, his face pale. They're creating copies of people. The marsh quicksand, Beatrice realized. It's not just killing people, it's delivering them here. They watched as Edmund and the professor moved toward a row of smaller chambers extending from the main room. Through glass panels, they could see figures floating in the same glowing liquid that filled the central tank. More test subjects? Edmund asked, examining one chamber. Yes, my lord. Travelers who strayed into the modified quicksand fields this week. The professor adjusted his spectacles. Though none as valuable as Captain Ashford, of course. Edmund's laugh echoed coldly. Indeed. The Queen's most trusted explorer, now replaced by our creation, programmed to serve our interests while she remains none the wiser. Leonard's hands tightened on his sword, knuckles white. I'm not their creation, he hissed. I have my own thoughts, my own will. The programming isn't perfect, Beatrice whispered back. You're not following whatever instructions they implanted. They fell silent as Edmund and the professor continued their inspection, eventually stopping before a chamber separated from the others. Inside, restrained to a metal table, lay an unconscious man. Leonard's breath caught. That's me. The original Leonard Ashford lay pale but alive, monitoring equipment tracking his vital signs. Edmund studied him through the glass with clinical detachment. Maintain his condition, he instructed the professor. We may need more neural patterns if the current duplicate fails. And if the duplicate succeeds in its mission? The professor asked. Edmund's smile was chilling. Then Captain Ashford will have the honor of being the first in a long line of royal advisors replaced by more cooperative versions. Beatrice had heard enough. She pulled Leonard back into the tunnel. We need to free him and alert the Queen, she whispered urgently. This goes beyond just you. Edmund is planning to replace the entire royal court. Leonard nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on his original self. How? There are dozens of guards, workers. Beatrice assessed the situation with a soldier's precision. We create a diversion. Something to evacuate the main chamber. Her eyes fell on the processing equipment. Those tanks, what happens if they rupture? The fluid is highly conductive, Leonard replied. It would create electrical surges throughout the system. Perfect. Beatrice retrieved a small crossbow from her belt, a compact weapon she carried for emergencies. Wait for my signal, then make for the isolation chamber. I'll meet you there. Before Leonard could protest, she slipped away, circling the perimeter of the main chamber until she reached the power conduits feeding the central tank. Taking careful aim, she fired a bolt directly into the main junction box. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Sparks erupted, followed by a cascade of electrical failures. The luminescent fluid bubbled ominously as alarms blared throughout the facility. Emergency protocols, shouted the professor as workers scrambled to stabilize the system. Evacuate the main chamber. In the ensuing chaos, Leonard darted across the room, keeping to the shadows until he reached the isolation chamber. The door was locked, but the power fluctuations had affected the security systems. After a moment of struggle, the lock disengaged. Inside, the original Leonard Ashford stirred at the commotion, his eyes widening in shock as he beheld his own face staring down at him. What manner of, he began, struggling against his restraints. No time to explain, the duplicate Leonard said, cutting through the bindings. Can you walk? The original Leonard sat up shakily. I think so. They've kept me sedated, but, his eyes narrowed in sudden recognition. You're the duplicate they created. Yes, Leonard acknowledged, helping his original self to his feet. But I'm not what they intended me to be. He managed a grim smile. Apparently, your sense of duty to the Queen was too deeply ingrained for them to override. The original Leonard studied his duplicate with fascination rather than fear. Two of me. Extraordinary. He swayed slightly. What's the plan? Beatrice is creating a diversion. We need to. The door burst open, revealing Beatrice, her uniform singed and a bleeding cut across her forehead. Time to go. They're regaining control of the systems. She faltered momentarily, seeing the two Leonids standing together, but quickly regained her composure. Both of you, follow me. There's an emergency exit through the eastern tunnels. They fled through corridors now filled with smoke and panicked workers. Guards attempted to intercept them, but the confusion worked in their favor. The original Leonard, despite his weakened state, fought with the skill of the Queen's finest explorer, while his duplicate matched him move for move. As they reached the eastern tunnel, Lord Edmund's voice bellowed through the facility, "Find them. The Ashfords must not reach the surface." The tunnel sloped upward, leading away from the estate toward the marshes. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Almost there, Beatrice encouraged as both Leonids began to tire. Suddenly, the tunnel ahead collapsed in a shower of rock and dirt. Standing before them, sword drawn, was Lieutenant Rowan, the head of the Queen's personal guard. "Treason, Lieutenant Winters?" Rowan asked, his eyes moving between the two identical men. "Conspiring with Lord Edmund's abominations?" "No, Rowan," Beatrice replied, keeping her weapon lowered. "Exposing his treason. He plans to replace the Queen's advisors with duplicates loyal to him." Rowan's expression remained stone-like. "And why should I believe you?" The original Leonard stepped forward. "Because I've served the Queen alongside you for 15 years, Rowan. You know where my loyalties lie." "Both of your loyalties," the duplicate Leonard added. "We need to reach the Queen before Edmund realizes his plan has failed." For a tense moment, Rowan's sword remained pointed at them. Then, with a swift motion, he turned it around, offering the hilt to Leonard, "Either of them." "Then we'd best hurry," Rowan said. "The Queen holds court within the hour, and Lord Edmund will be in attendance." As they emerged from the tunnel into the misty dawn, the four unlikely allies raced toward the palace, knowing the future of the kingdom now depended on which Leonard Ashford the Queen would believe, and whether they could reach her before Edmund's conspirators sealed their fate. The royal court of Aldoria buzzed with the day's business. Nobles and officials lined the grand hall, their colorful attire creating a living tapestry beneath the vaulted ceiling. At the far end, Queen Eleonora sat upon the ancient throne, her expression attentive but tinged with the melancholy that had shadowed her since Leonard Ashford's reported death. Lord Edmund stood at her right hand, leaning occasionally to whisper counsel in her ear. His position as royal advisor had strengthened in the days following the captain's demise, a convenient advancement that now appeared far from coincidental. "The delegation from the western provinces awaits your decision on the mining rights, Your Majesty," the court herald announced. The Queen nodded thoughtfully. "Before I rule, I would hear Lord Edmund's assessment of the proposal's impact on our existing resources." Edmund stepped forward, a satisfied smile barely concealed beneath his formal demeanor. "Your Majesty is wise to consider all implications. I believe." The massive doors to the royal hall burst open, cutting off his words. Guards scrambled to intercept the intruders, then froze in confusion at the sight before them. Lieutenant Beatrice Winters entered first, her uniform bearing the marks of recent combat. Behind her came Lieutenant Rowan, his sword drawn not against the intruders but positioned to defend them. And behind him, two identical men, both bearing the unmistakable face of Captain Leonard Ashford. A collective gasp rippled through the court. The Queen rose from her throne, her composure momentarily shattered. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, though her voice trembled slightly. Lord Edmund's face drained of color. "Guards! Arrest these impostors immediately." He turned to the Queen. "Your Majesty, this is clearly some form of treasonous deception." "Silence," the Queen commanded, her authority instantly reasserting itself. She fixed her gaze on Beatrice. "Lieutenant Winters, explain this impossibility." Beatrice stepped forward and knelt. "Your Majesty, I discovered Captain Ashford alive in Thornwick Village days after his supposed death in the Quicksands. Upon investigation, we uncovered a conspiracy of unprecedented scale." She gestured to the two Leonids. "One of these men is the captain we have always known. The other is his duplicate, created through ancient technology Lord Edmund has been secretly developing beneath his estate." Murmurs of shock echoed through the hall. Edmund's hand moved subtly toward the dagger at his belt. "Preposterous," he scoffed. "The lieutenant has clearly lost her mind. There is no such technology." "There is," both Leonids stated simultaneously, then looked at each other in surprise. The original Leonard continued. "Your Majesty, the ruins I've been exploring contained more than energy sources. They held the secrets to creating perfect duplicates of living beings. Lord Edmund has been using the Quicksands to capture people for his experiments, intending to replace your trusted advisors with duplicates loyal to him." "Lies!" Edmund shouted, abandoning his composure. "This man speaks treason." The Queen studied both Leonids, her intelligent eyes moving between them. "If what you say is true, which of you is my captain, and which the duplicate?" A heavy silence fell. The duplicate Leonard stepped forward first. "I emerged from the Quicksand believing myself to be Leonard Ashford," he said quietly. "Every memory, every loyalty felt real. But in Lord Edmund's laboratory, we found the truth." He gestured to his counterpart. "He is the original. I am the copy, created to serve Edmund's purposes, though something in the process failed. His attempt to override my loyalty to you was unsuccessful." The original Leonard nodded. "They kept me prisoner, extracting my memories to perfect the duplicate. They intended him to subtly undermine your rule, making decisions that would weaken the kingdom while appearing to serve you faithfully." The Queen's gaze shifted to Edmund, whose face had hardened into cold calculation. "Cousin, what say you to these accusations?" Edmund's laugh was bitter. "You always did favor Ashford's counsel over mine, Eleonora. Even now, faced with this absurdity, you consider it might be true." His hand moved in a subtle signal, and several guards around the chamber suddenly changed stance, turning their weapons toward the Queen rather than the intruders. "The throne should have been mine," Edmund snarled, dropping all pretense. "A woman ruler? The kingdom deserves better. My duplicates would have ensured a smooth transition, the court gradually turning against you until abdication became inevitable." He drew his dagger. "Now we'll have to arrange a more immediate succession." His loyal guards moved forward, but they were outnumbered. Lieutenant Rowan and the royal guards who remained faithful quickly surrounded the Queen, while Beatrice and both Leonids drew their weapons. "You are outnumbered, Edmund," the Queen said calmly. "Surrender, and you may yet keep your head." Edmund's eyes darted around the room, calculating his odds. With a sudden movement, he grabbed a nearby courtier, pressing his dagger to the man's throat. "I'm leaving this hall," he announced. "Anyone who attempts to stop me will have this man's blood on their conscience." He began backing toward a side door, his hostage whimpering in fear. The guards held their positions, unwilling to risk the courtier's life. The duplicate Leonard caught the original's eye and made a subtle gesture toward the rafters above. The original understood immediately, years of expedition planning had given them identical tactical thinking. Now, the original Leonard shouted, launching a dagger toward a decorative banner hanging above Edmund. The duplicate simultaneously hurled a heavy candlestick at the banner's mounting. The massive fabric came crashing down, momentarily blinding Edmund and loosening his grip on the hostage, who scrambled to safety. Before Edmund could recover, both Leonids were upon him, subduing him with identical precision. The traitorous guards, seeing their leader captured, quickly surrendered. "Take Lord Edmund to the dungeons," the Queen commanded. and gather every record from his estate. I want to know the full extent of this plot. As the court settled, the queen descended from her throne and approached the two Lenads, studying them with wonder. In all my years, she said softly, I never imagined facing such a situation. She turned to the original. Captain Ashford, your loyalty has never wavered, even in the face of this ordeal. Thank you, Your Majesty, he replied with a bow. The queen then turned to the duplicate. And you, created to betray me, yet you chose to serve. Why? The duplicate Leonard knelt before her. I have his memories, his sense of duty. Whatever Edmund intended, he could not erase what makes Leonard Ashford who he is, his unwavering loyalty to you and to Aldoria. The queen nodded thoughtfully. Two identical men, both claiming the same identity. This presents complications. Indeed, Your Majesty, the original Leonard agreed. I am willing to step aside if... No, the queen interrupted. You have served me faithfully for years. Your place at court remains secure. She turned to the duplicate. But what of you? What place can there be for a second Leonard Ashford? The duplicate considered this. The world is vast, Your Majesty. I have all the skills and knowledge of an explorer, but perhaps I could use them differently. The far reaches of the kingdom remain unmapped. I could continue the work of exploration, but in new territories. A solution with merit, the queen agreed. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Though you began as a copy, you have proven yourself unique in your choices. From this day forward, you shall be known as Sir Thomas Ashford, distant cousin to Leonard, returned from foreign lands. I grant you the title of Royal Explorer of the Outer Territories. The newly named Thomas bowed deeply. I am honored, Your Majesty. In the weeks that followed, Edmund's conspiracy unraveled completely. The ancient technology was studied carefully under the Queen's direct supervision, its potential for energy harnessed while its darker applications were dismantled. The duplicate chambers were destroyed, and those unwitting souls who had been copied were given the choice of integration into society under new identities or comfortable exile with generous compensation. The quicksands of the Veiled Marshes were marked with permanent warning beacons, and royal guards patrolled regularly to ensure no travelers met the fate that had befallen Leonard. 6 months later, Captain Leonard Ashford stood at the palace gates, watching as a small expedition prepared to depart. At its head, Thomas Ashford, no longer a duplicate but a man forging his own identity, checked the final preparations. The northwestern expanse awaits, Thomas said as Leonard approached. Your maps ended at the frost ridges. Everything beyond is unknown. Leonard smiled at his counterpart. If anyone can chart those territories, it's you. He handed Thomas a sealed letter. The Queen asked me to give you this. Private instructions, I believe. Thomas accepted it with a nod. And you? Back to the marshes to continue your research? With significant precautions this time, Leonard confirmed. The energy technology could transform the kingdom, just as we originally hoped. He extended his hand. Safe travels, cousin. Thomas clasped his hand firmly. And to you. Perhaps in a year or two, we'll compare discoveries over whiskey, though not in that tavern in Thornwick. They shared a laugh at the memory, now more amusing than disturbing with time's passage. As Thomas mounted his horse and the expedition began to move, Leonard watched his other self depart, a living reminder that identity was more than memories or appearance, but the choices one made and the loyalties one honored. From her window in the palace, Queen Eleonora observed the departure as well. The conspiracy had shaken the kingdom, but also strengthened it. Edmund's betrayal had exposed weaknesses in the court that she had now fortified. And in gaining a second Leonard Ashford, she had not only maintained her most trusted advisor but gained a valuable explorer for the kingdom's expansion. Quite extraordinary, she murmured to herself, to find a blessing in what began as treachery. As Thomas's expedition disappeared beyond the city gates, heading toward uncharted territories and whatever future awaited a man who began as a copy but would write his own story, the Queen turned back to the business of ruling, with the original Leonard Ashford once again at her side, their bond of loyalty stronger than ever. And in the deepest dungeon beneath the palace, Lord Edmund sat alone in his cell, his grand ambitions reduced to the damp stones surrounding him. The technology he had sought to exploit had created not his path to power, but instead the very instrument of his downfall, a perfect copy of the Queen's most loyal servant, whose dedication had proven impossible to erase.